And welcome everybody to the virtual Huntington Library. I really wish that we were in Rothenberg Hall to welcome you all, but we are of course in the Zoom format able to reach a much larger audience. So we're delighted that you've joined us this afternoon. This is the 2021 program in the Isherwood-Bachardy lecture series, which is made possible by an extremely generous gift, an endowment from the Christopher Isherwood Foundation to promote interest in the life and work of Christopher Isherwood and of Don Bachardy, and in LGBTQ culture in California more generally. As Ben said, my name is Steve Hindle and I'm Director of Research here at the Huntington. We had over 500 reservations for this afternoon's program, and I'll be your virtual host up here on the Hollywood Squares this afternoon. Tonight's program is entitled The Object of My Nostalgia, designating the Isherwood-Bachardy residence and studio in Los Angeles, and is presented by three associates of the Los Angeles-based historic preservation consultants, Chattel. As you will hear and see, the Chattel team was engaged by the Isherwood Foundation in 2018 to prepare a local landmark designation for the Isherwood-Bachardy property in the Pacific Palisades neighborhood of Los Angeles. They will describe their work on the nomination and explain how the Christopher Isherwood papers held here at the Huntington Library played a key role in documenting the significance of this important place in the history of Southern California. So let me introduce our speakers. Robert Chattel is a historic architect and architectural historian who founded Chattel in 1994. He's prepared numerous nominations to the National Register and to local registers, and has been involved in the rehabilitation of important historic buildings, including the Los Angeles Central Library. He's President Emeritus of the California Historical Society. So welcome, Robert. Nels Youngborg is an architectural historian who's been with Chattel since 2015 and worked on a wide variety of projects, including historic tax credit certification, including the adaptive reuse of former office buildings into housing, including several well-known buildings in LA, the Garment Capitol, the Maxfield, and the Grather and Grather buildings. Alvin Christian Nuval is a planner who joined Chattel as an intern in 2018 and is now associate responsible for a wide range of projects as diverse as a 1939 WPA constructed Adobe house in Bakersfield and recent National Register nominations for the Griffith House in Laguna Beach and for Malaga Grove Plaza in Palos Verdes Estates. I'm delighted also to say that we're joined by Catherine Bucknell, the Executive Director of the Christopher Isherwood Foundation and well-respected Isherwood scholar and editor in her own right. And Kate will participate in the question and answer period following the presentation. Most of all, we are thrilled to welcome to the Zoom panel Don Bachardy, who quite literally needs no introduction. You can't hear it over the Zoom webinar, Don, but I can reassure you that if we were in Rothenberg Hall, there would be a lot of love in the room right now. It's really great to have you with us this afternoon. So, introductions over. One final reminder, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar throughout the program. But that said, let's proceed. Robert, Nels, and Alvin, over to you.
So the team at Chattel is thrilled to be here today and to provide some information about how a property is designated locally in the city of Los Angeles. I'm going to introduce our effort by doing a brief overview and looking at some comparable properties. So next slide, please. We're here today really to celebrate the life and work of Christopher Isherwood and Don Bachardy. These images, which you'll see again in this presentation, show them at work at the property. And properties that are associated with important people are significant because they did their important work on the premises. So on the left, Christopher Isherwood is busy at work at a typewriter in his study, and Don Bachardy on the right is in his studio. Next slide, please. So In Los Angeles and California in the United States, we have levels and forms of designation. At the federal level, we have the National Register of Historic Places. At the state level, the California Register of Historical Resources. And at the local level, the City of Los Angeles list of historic cultural monuments. The designation is an honorific of sorts. It recognizes the important contributions of people, of architecture, and of events that are important in identifying a place as significant. These places serve as our collective memory and represent an important aspect of our history. Properties typically are real properties in that they are real estate, they're owned, they can be public or private. In this case, a private house and studio, as we'll describe more fully. They often involve improvements, so not just the land, but what's built on that land. They include habitable buildings, structures that aren't habitable, objects, and landscapes. Landscapes are usually of a designed sort, not just natural. They can certainly be a combination of designed and natural landscapes. And collectively, they could also form historic districts. Districts often contain a number of contributing resources that are of all of those resource types: building, structures, objects, and landscapes. So just a brief overview of the property. The image on the screen shows the property to the left, 145 Adelaide Drive in the city of Los Angeles. The street, the roadway on the right, Adelaide Drive, is technically within the city limits of the city of Santa Monica. So 145 Adelaide in the city of Los Angeles to the left, to the north, the roadway itself in the city of Santa Monica to the right. Next image, please. This is a similar view, but now looking east, and you can see a glimpse of the remarkable view. The property sits on the south rim of Santa Monica Canyon, and we'll talk a good bit about the context of Santa Monica Canyon. Next slide, please. Most properties that are listed at the National Register, California Register, or locally are eligible for their architecture. And we have a property here that's not been identified significant for its architecture. It takes more effort, I have to say, to identify the significance of a property that one is not visible from the street. As you could see from the first images, the property steps down from the roadway and is tucked in the side of the canyon. It was originally constructed in 1926 and contains a number of alterations that we'll review in more detail. The stairs on the right are part of alterations made in 1976, which lead to the front door of the residence shown on the left. Next slide, please. There are a couple of images of the interior. And through the front door that you just saw in the previous slide, one enters the living room and dining room space. Next slide, please. This is the dining room area with French doors out to a deck. And you'll see how these images demonstrate how the building has changed over time and the sort of richness of the collection of art and other artifacts that are in the house. Next slide. The master bedroom with a sliding glass door out to the deck. That deck was constructed in 1962. Next slide. This is Christopher Isherwood's study and the desk at which he worked. That is the same desk as shown in that first image. Next slide. This is the lower level of Don's artist studio. This was originally the garage of the residence, converted in 1962 into Don's studio. And the next image is of the second floor of the studio, added in 1976. So this is Don's studio. Next slide. The image on the left is of Don's studio with expansive deck. You'll see another image of that shortly. And then the deck added in 1962 to the house. The wrought iron furniture is one of the features that has been there since at least 1962. Next slide, please. And this is the view from Don's deck. So now you can get a much more expansive view of the ocean. And the setting is particularly important to the works that were created here, as we'll discuss. And the view northwest of the north side, north rim of the canyon across the way. Next slide, please. And then a view northeast from the main house. Next slide, please. The house is as I said, tucked in the south rim of the canyon. It's located between Adelaide Drive in the city of Santa Monica and Ocean, which is the street immediately to the south, downslope from the house. Originally, there was a public walking path that ran from Ocean to Adelaide that bisected the property. The city abandoned that walking street in 1959, and it was incorporated into the private property. Next slide. So I wanted to go over the eligibility criteria. The National Register and California Register are fairly similar. And we're looking at a property that's significant for its association with important people, which is criterion B under National Register criterion. The National Register contains about 100,000 properties nationwide. Those properties include districts, so many more than 100,000, but just to give you an idea. So under criterion B, a property would be significant if it's associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. Next slide, please. The California Register of Historical Resources, which was put in place in 1992 with regulations put in place in 1998, uses similar criteria. It reads slightly differently and they're numbered instead of lettered. Number 2, it is associated with the lives of persons important to local California or national history. Should probably just mention that the National Register of Historic Places, which is our official national list, properties are listed at the local, state, and national level. And that program was put in place in 1966 with the National Historic Preservation Act. Next slide, please. And lastly in this group, the City of Los Angeles list of historic cultural monuments uses these 3 criteria. The fourth of all of these criteria typically is for archaeology, and the City of Los Angeles does not use an archaeological, either historic or prehistoric archaeological criteria. It simply doesn't exist. The City of Los Angeles's designation program predates the National Register. It was instituted in 1962 with the first 6 historic cultural monuments, and there's now over 1,200 monuments designated by the City Council in Los Angeles. The City of Los Angeles also has 35 historic preservation overlay zones, our form of local historic district. In those HPOZs, there are more than 25,000 additional properties. So a total of over 26,000 properties are designated in Los Angeles. So the Isherwood-Bachardy Residence and Studio is designated under criterion 2 of the City of Los Angeles criteria. It is associated with the lives of historic personages important to national, state, city, or local history. Next slide. So I wanted to share some images of comparable properties to help put the Isherwood-Bachardy property in context. So first, the Edward and America Griffith House in the Three Arch Bay neighborhood of Laguna Beach. This is a property that our firm listed in the National Register earlier this year. It's also listed in the Laguna Beach Register, and it has a period of significance of 1927 to 1956. Properties associated with important personages often have long periods of significance because those people lived there typically for a long time. This property was developed by America and Edward Griffith in 1927, and they lived there until the 1970s. This is an early photograph of America, who was an actress, next to the lighthouse on the property, which is a lighthouse but has no beacon. Next slide. This is an oceanfront property in the South Laguna area in the city of Laguna Beach, and again, developed in 1927. It was where filmmaker Edward and his actress wife, America Griffith, hosted Hollywood luminaries, did business deals, and they were also important in establishing the Three Arch Bay community, which is now a private gated enclave in South Laguna. Next slide. So this is an image showing that lighthouse. Again, it doesn't have a beacon, and how the house developed over time. Next slide. It's an American colonial revival complex of buildings on a bluff overlooking the ocean. But really what's important is how it was used by these important people. Next slide. So the interiors are relatively intact from an early period. This is the way it looks today on the interior. Next slide. Included in this designation is a site feature, a structure, which is a tidal pool. The mean high tide is just outside this line. So this is private property in California. And in the 1930s, the Griffiths constructed a tidal pool. Next slide. And as is typical in a nomination, we do a great deal of research to identify historic photographs and be able to place the important personages, in this case, to the property. So this is a photograph of America next to the tidal pool. Next slide. The second comparable example that I wanted to share is the Sam and Elfrida Maloof compound in the Alta Loma neighborhood of Rancho Cucamonga. This property is also listed in the National Register, listed in the California Register, and the California Register includes listings in the National Register automatically. It's also separately listed as a Rancho Cucamonga historic resource. It has, again, a long period of significance, 1952 to 2000. And it represents a period of time when Sam Maloof, who was an internationally renowned woodworker, and his artist wife and business operator, Elfrida, owned and operated a business, a woodworking business on the property. Next slide. Sam is most well known for his design and construction of custom-made rockers and other furniture, but this is his kind of signature rocking chair. Sam is standing at the gate, which is in a tower at the entrance to the main house on the property. Next slide, please. This is now a compound of about 5 acres in size. There are about 12 buildings on the property today, 3 of which constitute the historic core of the campus. The house, a workshop, and a guest house. The other buildings were constructed after these buildings were moved to this site, which is a whole nother story. But it's quite a remarkable place. It today contains a gallery, an archival facility, wood storage, a new residence, and it's a public facility in a neighborhood in Rancho Cucamonga. It's open 2 days a week. They're just reopening the first week in May. Next slide, please. The house was constructed over a 50-year period as funds were available. And in the neighborhood of Alta Loma in unincorporated Rancho Cucamonga at the time, in the neighborhood of Alta Loma, Sam was able to build, without a building permit, pavilions of 100 square feet or less. And that's why the house is really quite remarkable and artistic. And it's significant in addition to its association with Sam for its architecture, because it's quite unique and artistic representation of Sam's own unique style. Next slide. So like Christopher Isherwood, who worked in the study, and Don Bachardy, who still works in his studio, Sam Maloof did his important work in a wood shop. And this is the wood shop with patterns of the various pieces of furniture that Sam was well known for creating here in this place. Next slide. So again, Sam Maloof at the gates to the house, and with one of the most important individual, as we call them, character-defining features, a stair that Sam created for the house in much the same manner as he created his own quite remarkable furniture. Next slide, please. So to just end this group of comparable properties, this was Sam Maloof's most ambitious woodworking project, and it was relocated to this site. So it's quite remarkable that it's now been listed in the National Register. Next slide, please. Back to the subject at hand. So this is a photograph from May of last year of representatives of the city of Los Angeles, with Don Bachardy on the right, showing some of his art to the team, along with Tina Mascara, who's with Don this evening. So our firm was engaged by Don Bachardy and the Christopher Isherwood Foundation in 2018. We submitted a nomination in writing on a prescribed form to the City of Los Angeles Office of Historic Resources in 2019. The way the process works in Los Angeles is that the city's Cultural Heritage Commission, which is comprised of members appointed by the mayor of Los Angeles, first hold a take under consideration hearing that was held in February of 2020. Just before COVID, we were able to do this site visit, which occurred at the end of February in 2020. After the site visit, the Cultural Heritage Commission considers in a final determination hearing their recommendation to City Council, which they did on May 21st, 2020. They make a recommendation to City Council. That recommendation is considered first by the Planning and Land Use Management Committee of City Council. We have a 15-member council, and this is a smaller group that considers the nomination and recommendation of the Cultural Heritage Commission in committee. The committee considered the nomination on October 25th, 2020, recommending favorably to City Council, which acted on October 28th, 2020. And the Isherwood-Bachardy residence and studio is now Historic Cultural Monument number 1212. So in this photograph on the left, Len Wen, who represents Council Member Mike Bonin of Council District 11. There are two Cultural Heritage Commissioners, Gail Kennard is the next person to Len's right. Standing next to Don in the striped shirt is Diane Canner, the other Cultural Heritage Commissioner. Melissa Jones, Nels Youngborg, and Lambert Giesinger from the City of Los Angeles complete the composition here. So I'll turn it over to Alvin.
Great. Thank you, Robert. So as Robert mentioned, designating the subject property under criterion 2 for significance with associated persons required that we first describe the significance of the historic persons involved, in this case, Christopher Isherwood and Don Bachardy, and then connect that to the significance of the property itself. So in doing so, Chattel developed several historic contexts to provide the City of Los Angeles and the Cultural Heritage Commission with background information intended to support the nomination's statement of significance. Inclusion of historic context helps provide readers with a better understanding of the importance of a property and illuminate relevant history for people who may not be fully aware of Isherwood and Bachardy's lives and contributions. So in the City of Los Angeles, there's Survey LA, which is the citywide historic resources survey, and it's intended to be used as a tool to identify, record, and evaluate historic properties and districts in Los Angeles. It's often one of the very first places that local researchers check to evaluate the significance of a property. And Survey LA includes contexts on various themes, including commercial development, the entertainment industry, and architecture and engineering. But more recently, the City of Los Angeles has been working to bolster more ethnic cultural contexts, such as the LGBT historic context published in 2014 that describes important people and events that are related to the LGBT history of Los Angeles. This context describes both Isherwood and Bachardy, highlighting their contributions as a writer and a portrait artist, respectively. And Isherwood was described as one of the most important writers who lived in Los Angeles, while Bachardy was noted as arguably LA's most celebrated portrait painter. The historic context also identified the subject property as a known local resource, though only connected it to the life of Isherwood, as shown here. So while Survey LA serves as a jumping off point for some of the background on these figures and their home, we did additional research to describe Isherwood and Bachardy more substantially. And then before I go into the Chattel context themselves, I also do want to point out that the principal city planner for the City of Los Angeles and manager of the Office of Historic Resources, Ken Bernstein, just published a book today called Preserving Los Angeles, which includes some of the Chattel photographs of the Isherwood-Bachardy residence, similarly to the Survey LA context, briefly describing the significance of Isherwood and Bachardy. So now let's explore some of the contexts that help make the subject property significant, starting with Christopher Isherwood. Born in Cheshire, England in 1904, Isherwood was a writer who wrote a mix of fiction and nonfiction books, poetry, screenplays, stage plays, and articles. And prior to emigrating to the United States, Isherwood had already garnered acclaim as a writer throughout Europe. He briefly studied at Cambridge and King's College before moving to Berlin in 1929, publishing his first novel, All the Conspirators. Isherwood developed a personal style of writing based on observation of what was going on around him. And some of his personal experiences are integrated into his work, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. In 1933, he fled Berlin due to persecution from Nazis. And in 1939, Isherwood moved to Los Angeles to write for the movies. One of Isherwood's most famous works is Goodbye to Berlin, a collection of short semi-autobiographical stories about his life in Berlin between 1930 and 1933. One particular short story within the book, Sally Bowles, would later be adapted into a musical, Cabaret, and later further adapted into a feature film starring Liza Minnelli. Another one of his famous works is the 1964 novel, A Single Man, one of the first novels in popular culture that depicted homosexuality as a humanistic trait. A Single Man told the story of an English college professor in Los Angeles named George, who is still grieving the loss of his partner, Jim. The novel has since been celebrated for humanizing the experiences of a gay man at a time when such topics were still considered taboo, and was also later adapted into a feature film in 2009, starring Colin Firth in an Academy Award-nominated role as George. Tom Ford, who was the director and co-writer of the movie, was the previous speaker of the Isherwood-Bachardy lecture in 2018. So Isherwood would move into the subject property with Don Bachardy in 1959. And while living there, Isherwood would continue to write several more novels and screenplays, including A Single Man in 1964 and a 1976 memoir, Christopher and His Kind, which was also later adapted into a film. Isherwood was an avid diarist and wrote in his diary several times a week, almost continuously for about 60 years, from early 1920s to July 1983. And his diaries were published in multiple volumes between 1997 and 2012, edited by Catherine Bucknell. The works that Isherwood wrote or completed at the subject property are important in helping to illuminate the significance of the property itself. The subject property is where Isherwood did some of his most important works for multiple decades. And in this photo shown here, Isherwood is seen working in his study at the eastern end of the property at the desk that is still oriented the same way today. I also want to take this time to briefly talk about the dolphin clocks here, shown here sitting on Isherwood's desk. This clock survived the bomb blast and was presented to Isherwood by his Berlin landlady, who visited when he visited after World War II. The clock was used as a prop in both the film adaptations for A Single Man and Christopher and His Kind, and it still sits on Isherwood's desk today. And we'll revisit this a little bit more later in this presentation. But of course, the subject property is not significant for Christopher Isherwood alone, and is also important for its association with artist Don Bachardy, who still lives there. Born in Los Angeles in 1934, Bachardy is an accomplished portrait painter who studied at UCLA, the Chouinard Institute in Los Angeles, and the Slade School of Art in London. In 1961, Bachardy had his first solo exhibition at the Red Fern Gallery in London, where he described it as his first original introduction as his life as an artist. So from 1960s through the 1970s, Bachardy solidified his unique approach as a portrait artist and was described as capturing the essence of his subjects and conveying the spirit of time and place in which the portraits were made. He's particularly recognized for his portraits of well-known figures and celebrities, including movie actors, writers, and political figures, including Elton John, Katharine Hepburn, Joan Didion, and James Baldwin. People would physically sit for portraits at Bachardy's studio at the subject property. One of Bachardy's most notable works was the gubernatorial portrait of Jerry Brown, shown here, which was painted in 1984 in an expressionist style with bold colors. This departure from traditional portrait style drew publicity and controversy at the time. The portrait was intended to be hung on the first floor of the California State Capitol building, but following the controversy, it was hung at a secondary location on the third floor stairwell. Today, the portrait hangs in the California State Capitol Museum. In fact, many of Bachardy's work is held in permanent collections around the world, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, DC, and the National Portrait Gallery in London. And like Isherwood, much of Bachardy's work was created at the subject property in his studio. So relating back to the examples that Robert had shared earlier, talking about couples, though Isherwood and Bachardy are individually significant for their respective creative careers, they also influenced each other as they made the subject property their home. Isherwood met Don Bachardy on the beach at the mouth of Santa Monica Canyon in 1951. They were introduced by Bachardy's brother, Ted Bachardy, and were acquaintances for 2 years before meeting properly and starting a relationship in 1953. And as Isherwood and Bachardy became more committed to each other, they moved in together and traveled extensively. They resided at a few different locations in and around Santa Monica Canyon before purchasing the subject property in 1959. Throughout their relationship, they played an active role in supporting each other's work. As they were beginning their relationship, Isherwood finished and Bachardy typed a novel on which he worked on for some years, The World in the Evening. Bachardy also collaborated with Isherwood on a screenplay for Frankenstein, The True Story, in 1973. And then in turn, Isherwood posed for many portraits by Bachardy. One book by Bachardy featuring these portraits was called Last Drawings of Christopher Isherwood and published in 1990. So the subject property was more than just a home. It was their workspace, and that influence of Santa Monica Canyon found itself in some of their work. Santa Monica Canyon was known as a West Coast Bohemia and has gained a reputation in the 1920s and the 1930s as a haven for both eccentric and artistic individuals. It was relatively close to the entertainment industry of Hollywood, yet secluded enough that artists could enjoy refuge by the beach. It also attracted refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, such as director Berthold Viertel and actress and screenwriter Salka Viertel, both of whom were partially influenced Isherwood to go to California in the first place. Based on his experience living in Santa Monica Canyon, Isherwood published an essay in Harper's Bazaar titled California Story, later named The Shore, which describes his thoughts on the canyon. He writes, "The place in the United States I think of as home, and I feel very homesick for as I write these words, is the stretch of oceanfront running 5 or 6 miles south from Santa Monica Canyon to Venice, partly inside, partly outside the city limits of Los Angeles." He asks, "Why does one love places? Why do I love this one so much?" He also describes that Santa Monica Canyon, known always simply as the canyon to its dwellers, lies just north of the city of Santa Monica. It is a shallow, flat-bottomed little valley crowded with cottages of self-consciously rustic design, where cranky, kindly people live and tolerate each other's mind and often charming eccentricities. He wrote, "The canyon is our Western Greenwich Village, overrun now by various types of outsiders, but still maintaining an atmosphere of bohemianism and unpretentious artiness." And then towards the end of his essay, he writes, "So there you are. There you see the object of my nostalgia," where the title of this presentation gets its name. Santa Monica Canyon is not just a physical place, but a manifestation of emotions and experiences integral to Isherwood's being. And then the image behind this text shows a view of the canyon, the beach, and the ocean. But I want you to take note of this house that's sitting in the center on this bluff, as we'll return to it shortly. Santa Monica Canyon also makes another appearance in Isherwood's A Single Man, written by Isherwood while he was living at the subject property and based on his own personal experiences and his relationship with Bachardy. In describing the setting where the main character, George, lives, Isherwood writes, "They called their streets lanes, ways, or trails to go with the woodsy atmosphere they wanted to create. Their utopian dream was of subtropical English village with Montmartre manners, a little good place where you could paint a bit, write a bit, and drink lots. They saw themselves as rearguard individualists, making a last-ditch stand against the 20th century. They gave thanks loudly from morn till eve that they had escaped the soul-destroying commercialism of the city. They were tacky and cheerful and defiantly bohemian, tirelessly inquisitive about each other's doing and boundlessly tolerant." So by integrating Santa Monica Canyon into his work, Isherwood helps build the connection and significance between his writings and his home. So it's also important to note that while researching the significance of the subject property, it became clear that the residents and Santa Monica Canyon also helped influence other artists beyond just Isherwood and Bachardy. In particular, the residence found itself depicted in several of artist David Hockney's work. HOCKNEY was also identified in the Survey LA LGBT historic context mentioned earlier as one of the most acclaimed artists of the late 20th century. And he was noted for painting portraits of friends and acquaintances in Los Angeles, including Isherwood and Bachardy. So the painting shown here, which is titled A Visit with Christopher and Don, Santa Monica Canyon, is an excellent example of the subject property's influence on HOCKNEY's work. Created in 1984 and painted on oil in 2 canvases, this painting takes the viewer through the property and was a diptych with 2 large pieces intended to be shown together. This painting is a montage of different moments of David Hockney traveling through the house, as shown by the repetition of the house on the cliff that makes its appearance through various window openings in this painting. And this is the same house that was shown earlier. This painting is reminiscent of Hockney's Nichols Canyon, painted earlier in 1980. So starting with the left side of this image, we see an outline of Bachardy painting at his studio. Then we move into the living room where the pair of wicker chairs and table are visible. In the background, you can see Santa Monica Canyon, the beach and the ocean, and then the number 145, the address number for the subject property. On the right half, we move through the dining room and see the iron furniture on the balcony visible. Then we move through the bedroom and then into Isherwood's study where he can be seen working at his desk. So what makes this piece so special is how Hockney integrates many of the key details that tie the painting to Isherwood and Bachardy's home. From the cliffside house, shown here in the center, to the wicker chairs on the right, to the iron tables and chairs in the outdoor balcony, and Isherwood's desk, which is still oriented the same way after all of these years. And then shown over here, we even have that same dolphin clock that was mentioned earlier appearing on his desk, as it still does today. In 1968, Hockney painted this large double portrait of Isherwood and Bachardy sitting on wicker chairs in the living room, again featuring the subject property and connecting it to Isherwood and Bachardy's life and work. The slide is a bit of a teaser, and my colleague Nels will talk more about this image later on in the presentation, and Hockney's involvement as shown in these images from the Christopher Isherwood papers. I do want to point out that this image was prominently featured during an event at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2018, in which stage and screen actors Simon Callow and Alan Cumming did a live reading of love letters written between Isherwood and Bachardy, alongside Christopher Isherwood Foundation Executive Director Catherine Bucknell. We can see from the details that the details from the painting were incorporated into this reading, down to the wicker chairs that are being used and the clothing of each actor. And a video recording of this reading is available online through the Metropolitan Museum of Art website. As described, the importance of providing these historic contexts was to show that not only did Isherwood and Bachardy reside at the property, Isherwood until his death in 1986, and Bachardy still living there today, but they did much of their important work there. The period of significance included in the nomination of the property ended in 1990 with the publishing of last drawings of Christopher Isherwood, which was the last collaboration between Isherwood and Bachardy. And not only that, other artists such as David Hockney did important work there too. And the subject property made its importance known by being integrated into their pieces. That link between people and place was important to support the idea that the subject property was the best and most representative location associated with the lives of these figures. I do also want to point out that as part of the comprehensive investigation into the significance of the subject property, we also did do some research developing short contexts on the builder, C.L. Bundy, and the Spanish colonial revival architectural style. though ultimately neither of these were found to rise to the level of significance to qualify the subject property eligible as a historic cultural monument. So while the residence was developed by C.L. Bundy, who may be considered a builder who influenced his age, the residence is not a notable example of his work. And it also lacks many of the distinguishing factors, character-defining features associated with the Spanish colonial revival style, and has undergone several alterations over time. Shown here is a rough SketchUp model that was used to help provide an idea of the residence and a studio at the subject property and their relation to each other and the street. Isherwood and Bachardy improved the property to better suit their respective professions while living and working there. So even though there were alterations to the subject property, these alterations have gained significance over time. This includes the addition of the deck at the residence and the conversion of the garage into a separate studio in 1962, and then a enlarging of the studio to add a second floor in 1976, in which the carport was also moved. To talk more about the property itself and the research done with the Huntington, I'd like to now pass over this presentation to my colleague, Nels Youngborg.
Good afternoon, everyone. Continuing to talk about the historic context related to the property, and to add on to the fact that we added context to our historic cultural monument that we didn't actually apply to the eligibility of the property to become a historic cultural monument, includes the Santa Monica Canyon. Although the property is not significant because it's in Santa Monica Canyon, the property does add significance to the history of Santa Monica Canyon. So it was really important for us to create a context that helped to describe that for future researchers in order to connect the dots between the Isherwood-Bachardy residence and studio and the surrounding environment, which was so influential and so important and, to Isherwood and Bachardy. To kind of break apart the development and context of Santa Monica Canyon, there were 4 distinct periods of development that we're able to describe today. And that includes the Mexican land grant period from 1839 to 1870, the early American period from 1870 to 1920, our early Los Angeles period that ended in 1945, the end of World War II, and the late Los Angeles period, which started after World War II and continues today. The Mexican land grant period started in 1839 when the ranchos were given to specific families. The Boca de Santa Monica rancho was given to the families of Reyes and Marquez, where the Reyes family occupied the northwestern portion of the Boca de Santa Monica, and the Marquez family settled on the south. The southern border of Boca de Santa Monica is actually the southern ridge of Santa Monica Canyon. During this time, the Marquez family developed the canyon with homesteads and other types of buildings that served their purposes. Included were their homestead, which is shown on the right, and also the Marquez Cemetery, shown on the left. The Marquez Cemetery, it's really incredible to have a photo like this housed at the Huntington Library, because it's one of the very few remaining examples extant today of the Marquez family and their built environment within this canyon. The cemetery includes interments that started in 1848 and the last was in 1916. The early American period started after 1970, which was a point at which more development was happening in the canyon that wasn't necessarily initiated by the Marquez family. Starting in the early 1870s, there were camps and other recreational uses of the mouth of the canyon. And the Marquez family did participate in the construction of, feature here as the Marquez bathhouse. But also there were, as a hotel that was constructed in the 1870s, as well as transportation. This incredible image from the Huntington Library allows us a really great view of the canyon in 1904. As you can see on the top part of the slide is a panorama, and the bottom is a small snippet of the panorama. Within this photograph, you'll notice the transportation and infrastructure developments that were occurring around this time period. Visible along the beach is the bridge and trestle that was part of the railway network. This railway network serviced the Long Wharf, which you can see out in the distance. The Long Wharf was constructed and completed in 1894, and at the time was the longest wharf in the world. It was competing with the San Pedro port at the time, and also was bidding to become the port of Los Angeles. However, by 1906, the San Pedro port began construction of their breakwater. In 1909, the port was annexed in the city of Los Angeles. And slowly after that, there was less and less shipping as part of the Long Wharf. And by 1920, most of it was deconstructed. And then the portion closer to the shore was just used as a fishing pier until 1933. However, that didn't stop the transportation. In 1891, a train stop was constructed, which is visible in this picture. It is the one-story building that is right next to the trestle, kind of towards the middle left of the screen. This train stop was a route that was on the balloon route, and it was operated from 1891 to 1933. During this time, there were multiple trips a day and serviced many different people, tourists seeking recreation and or employment in this area. The middle portion of this shows further development within the canyon and also the conjunction between Rustic Canyon and Santa Monica Canyon. Oftentimes, the Rustic Canyon and Santa Monica Canyon are referenced together, but I think it's important for the purposes of this to show that there were two kind of separate canyons that came together into the mouth of the Santa Monica Canyon. The right-hand side of this picture shows the northern parts of the Santa Monica Canyon. The Marquez family continued to own and develop this land, especially up on the mesa. In the distance, you can see the Marquez homestead, the canyon schoolhouse. Notice the ridge of the canyon along the right-hand side and how it travels up, meanders to the north towards the mountains. This perspective from 1906 is from the northern side of the canyon looking south. As you can see, from the same time period, you'll see people arriving at the train station on the lower right, and the arrow in the upper left shows the ultimate location of the Isherwood-Bachardy residence. It was constructed around 1926. Showing development of the canyon, this photograph from 1916 shows increased development in the area, as well as the eventual location of the Isherwood-Bachardy residence identified by the red arrow. This brings us to our next period of development, the early Los Angeles period. The development here began in the early 1920s, which was when the Marquez family sold their shares of land to the Santa Monica Land and Water Company, which was owned in part by C.L. Bundy. The image on this slide shows in 1918, the Westgate addition, which was annexed to the city of Los Angeles in 1918, included a majority of the Santa Monica Canyon. During this period, development continued to happen and was also marked by World War II. This aerial image from 1904 is wonderful. You can see that by this time, most of the area has been paved and plots are starting to really be developed at this time. Also by 1924, the Long Wharf has fallen out of commission. Most of it has been removed, and the trestle and the railroad has been removed as well. At this removal, the connection between the community and the beach is really enhanced, and the use of the beach and area as a recreational space increases. Here we see a tract map from 1924, and outlined in red is the Isherwood-Bachardy residence and studio property. It actually includes a few different parcels that are tied together, and you can see that it is a long triangle. The actual residence only occupies, the residence and studio only occupy on this page, the right-hand side, the larger portion of that triangle. Most of the property is actually undeveloped and unable to be developed because it's part of a very steep cliff in between Ocean Avenue, which is inside of the Santa Monica Canyon, and Adelaide, which is the street that runs parallel to the ridge. Here's another perspective taken by the same airplane in 1924. Here you can see what I was describing as the steep slope between Adelaide and Ocean Boulevard. Also, the inability to really develop this land that's on the smaller part of the triangle, whereas the larger part of the triangle is a little bit more of a gentle slope, which was eventually constructed on by installing a series of very large concrete retaining walls. This shows the approximate location of that same tract map and the outline of the property of the Christopher Isherwood and Bachardy residence and studio. This photo does not include the Isherwood and Bachardy residence and studio, which is just out of view to the bottom. You can see the arrow is showing where the residence is located. However, this image does show the retaining walls that were necessary in constructing on this land. As part of the construction of the Isherwood-Bachardy residence and studio, a sister house adjacent to this property was also constructed just to the east, and that the residence on the right-hand side of the picture is that residence. You can see the retaining walls and Isherwood-Bachardy residence and studios just out of view. This image from 1928 is a really interesting perspective compared to that 1904 panorama, which didn't show much development at all. Now we have paved roads, plots that are being sold, signage, and encouraging people to buy land and keep building. This aerial image from 1914 is the earliest image of the residence and studio that we were able to find. Within the red box in the call out, you'll see the red arrow is demarking the Isherwood and Bachardy residence and studio. Right there, tucked right under the ridge in between Adelaide and Ocean Avenue. This image also shows how by 1940, all the rail lines had been removed and the highway had been constructed. This highway now severed the connection between the community and the beach once again. You'll see that there's a limited development and a lot less connection between that community and the beach. This aerial from 1953 shows the period of late Los Angeles period, post World War II. Here you can see demarcated by the red arrow is the location of the Isherwood-Bachardy residence and studio. Interestingly enough, this aerial photograph is from 1953. So if you squint really carefully, you can see the people on the beach, and two of those people might just be Christopher Isherwood and Don Bachardy. Around this time was during the time when their budding relationship was occurring through meetings on the beach. This image from 1950 demonstrates the busy highway that separated the canyon from the coast. However, visible at the bottom of this picture is one of the existing pedestrian underpasses that was constructed to continue to encourage use of the beach in a safe way where people didn't have to cross the very busy highway. In the background, you can see further development of the neighborhood. This is the conjunction of Chautauqua and Channel Boulevard, Chautauqua moving up to the ridge and also providing access to the northern part of Santa Monica Canyon, and Channel that traveled up Santa Monica Canyon, branching off into Rustic and also continuing up into the northern parts of the Santa Monica Canyon. As mentioned previously, residents of the canyon included many significant artists and expatriates who completed their important works and contributions to their field while residing in the area. A few of these include the list and some of the photographs. First, and one of the most important to Christopher Isherwood, were both Berthold and Selka Vertel. They actually moved to Santa Monica Canyon in 1928, not full-time. They were full-time closer to 1940. However, at their behest, they were integral in getting Christopher Isherwood to come visit them at Santa Monica Canyon, which encouraged him to fall in love with the area. He actually lived over in an apartment over their garage in 1939 when he first was in the area. Other notable people are Jose Mujica, an opera singer and actor who constructed his home in 1929, which is attributed to John Byers. One important aspect of Jose Mojica's hacienda is that it encompassed structures that were constructed by the Marquez family in the late 1890s, including a small chapel. Although this house is from 1929, it is significant and associated with other periods of development within the canyon. Edward Weston was a famous photographer. Thomas Mann was an expatriate author. Bertolt Brecht, another expatriate, moved at the time. He was a significant poet and playwright. Cedric Gibbons and Dolores Del Rio featured at the bottom right-hand corner of the photographs. Famous actor and Cedric Gibbons, famous art director, and notably the designer of the Oscar, which is coming up pretty soon. Arnold Schoenberg, a composer and music theorist. Vicky Baum, a author. These are some of a few of the artists and expatriates that helped to create what became known as the West Coast Bohemia. To provide a little bit more context about the location of the canyon and a location of some of these resources, we have a few maps that I'd like to run you through. Featured in this map are Santa Monica Canyon, which is outlined in red, and Rustic Canyon outlined in orange. These are the approximate locations of these places. As you can see, they're just north of the city of Santa Monica. The ridge of Santa Monica Canyon almost runs parallel to a majority of what is San Vicente Boulevard. Looking more directly at it, you can see how the confluence of Rustic Canyon and Santa Monica Canyon come together at the mouth. Both of these canyons were places that encompass what people knew as the West Coast Bohemia, a place where artists and expatriates resided from 1920 through World War II. Also featured is the red icon, which shows the location of the Christopher Isherwood Don Bachardy residence and studio. As mentioned previously, the Marquez family cemetery is located within the Santa Monica Canyon and is one of the last remaining extant resources dating from the earliest periods of development within the canyon. As you can see, it is just north, it is just east from this perspective, it's just east from the subject property. Next slide. The Hacienda de Jose Mojica, which is very close to the Marquez family cemetery. As I said before, another early resource representing early development within the canyon. Next slide. The yellow markers indicate the expatriates and artists that were previously discussed. As you can see, not all of them lived within the canyon, but they lived around where the canyon was, and they oftentimes gathered at each other's houses, oftentimes in the canyon. As you can see, the Isherwood and Bachardy residence and studio is actually very close to Salka and Vertel's house, which is just beneath them further within the canyon. Importantly, the Eames house, which was constructed in 1949, was constructed in the later period. However, they are a very significant artist and architect representing the later periods of more modern development, but also showing that artists were continued to be drawn to the area and drew inspiration from the landscape and the community. The mouth of the Santa Monica Canyon isn't that wide. Here in this image, we can kind of see depicted a 3D rendering of the mouth of the Santa Monica Canyon with a few of the resources that we've previously discussed. You can actually see the Christopher Isherwood house from the Eames residence. Here, the photograph was taken at the Eames house property looking south across the canyon. Many of the views we've seen so far are from the Isherwood and Bachardy residence and studio, but here we can see all the way across and the resources. Next slide. Here tucked in is the Isherwood-Bachardy residence and studio. It is signified, thank you, Alvin, for the cursor. It is signified there, you can see on the right, the residence. In the middle, you'll see a dark portion, which is actually the carport. And to the right of the carport, the blue is the second floor of Don's studio. So here's the property as viewed from the other side of the canyon. Next slide. So the Huntington Library was integral in the research that was performed for creating the Historic Cultural Monument nomination. It provided the information necessary in order to connect Christopher Isherwood and Don Bachardy to the studio in a very intimate and unarguable way. Also used at the Huntington Library was the Ernest Marquez photograph collection. Ernest Marquez was a significant and Ernest Marquez is a descendant of the Marquez family and collected a significant amount of research from his family and as a historian in general. His collection has been donated to the Huntington Library, includes photographs from the mid-19th century all the way through the 20th century, not only of Santa Monica Canyon, which this 1885 photograph of a very small cabin somewhere in Santa Monica Canyon is, but also the photograph collection includes very important documentation of Santa Monica and other areas of Los Angeles through the 19th and 20th century. The Christopher Isherwood papers were primarily used for this report. And shown on this slide are representatives of the important types of documentation that we did find. In the upper left-hand corner is the very first picture of Chris and Don sitting in their residence after they purchased it in 1959. It was really important to be able to see the early photos about how the property looked in 1959 and then how it changed through time. Also, it was important to see how Chris and Don interacted with different areas of the property in order to create this story about why they needed to expand it and how those areas represent their important works. On the upper right shows, once again, very important construction photos that were available through the Christopher Isherwood papers, really to show the change over time. The lower two photos include two photos of David. One is a photo of David HOCKNEY, and the other is a letter. It was really incredible and very important to be able to see the correspondence to and from Christopher Isherwood alongside photographs that were from the same era. It helped to create this really wonderful story that was translated into our nomination. There are photographs of varying sizes and condition, and they're stored in this way. Here's an example, as I was discussing before, of the many different letters and photographs that are included in this collection that truly provide a clear view of the feelings, the emotions, the sights, the looks, everything about Christopher Isherwood's and Don's lives throughout the 20th century, and also throughout the time period that they were residing at this house. On the left is a letter from 1961, and on the right is a photograph of Don in 1960 at the residence. As mentioned before, the Christopher Isherwood papers allowed an in-depth view of how the property changed through time. The photo on the right, the photo on the left shows Don sunbathing on his partially finished patio. On the right is a contemporary picture of the same patio. You can see that, although in the picture is the partially finished, and of course the current picture is completely finished. However, all the photos that were included really helped show how these changes happened over time. Next slide. This interior view of Chris in his house in 1963, it was just incredible to see all these photos of how he existed. On the right is a contemporary view of the same area. Chris is standing at the top of the steps, and on the right you can see the very top of the steps where Chris was standing a few decades earlier. In 1963, there was art on the wall and different furniture, but you can see some of the same things here. You can see the tile floor, the wood on the landing, the mirrored wall behind Chris on the other side of the dining room, as well as the entryway to the hall that provides access to the bedrooms in the eastern part of the house. This view of 1963 of the entrance was really important. Currently, the entrance on the photo on the graph on the right shows the way the entrance currently looks. On the left, it's the way it looked in 1963. On 1963, this was before the Trex boards and the deck was installed. You'll see a privacy screen, a wooden privacy screen that was installed in 1966. That would have been important because this photograph from 1963 is most likely taken from the point of view of the public walkway just under the house, in between the house and Ocean Boulevard, that was previously documented in the photographs that Robert showed earlier in this presentation. The wooden screen would have been necessary in order to create a little bit more privacy around the entrance of the house. And now that is no longer extant. So these photographs were really the only record of the way it looked then. Here, we can see the construction of the second floor of the studio in 1976. The photographer on the left is standing on what would be the deck on the second floor of the studio, and the photograph on the right shows the contemporary view of it. It's not easy to see. However, in the left-hand picture, you'll notice that there is a clear story window that you can see through the interstitial space and then into what is the carport. Now, everything is studs here and this is under construction. The photograph on the right, you can see that clear story window is a frosted clear story window. If you're looking through the glass windows of the deck, and you can see how all this is coming together, and the Christopher Isherwood papers really allowed this. Next slide. Again, construction of the carport. Here on the left, you can see the construction photo as it's happening, and on the left is the carport as it exists today. It was important to see these pictures, not only how the changes happened, but also how not much has happened since these changes were implemented. These changes allowed for Don to continue his work as one of the most influential portrait painters in Los Angeles and continues to be. So construction of this residence and studio is viewed as an alteration that's taken on significance through time because it directly relates back to the eligibility of the property as a historic cultural monument. Finally, the next few pictures illustrate just how special the Christopher Isherwood papers were in telling a story. David HOCKNEY had a very special relationship and friendship with Christopher Isherwood and Don. Here, these photos in 1968 show a time that David came to visit Don and Chris, not only to visit them socially and personally, but also in order to photograph them as inspiration for what would be one of his most famous artworks. So on the right, you'll see David on the left, Chris in the middle, and Don sitting on the right-hand side of the picture at the table, which actually still exists today and is still sitting on Don's patio right outside the dining room. On the left is Chris and Don on the same day, a photograph taken by David as a perspective to provide inspiration for his painting of the two of them. Next slide. Later in 1968, David sent a progress letter to Don and Chris about the painting. So the photograph on the left is a copy of his just one-page letter letting Don know that he is thinking about another giant portrait of them, and he included some of the photos in this letter and also this small sketch of what he was going to do with this large painting that he says that he'll do, and he'll let you know when you start it. On the right is another progress image that David did, a very early selfie. You can see David on the bottom part of this picture and his painting above him. This is the monumental picture that he painted after sending Don this letter, letting him know that he was going to be continuing to paint them. Next slide. Here's a larger view of this image, which is just so cool and so special to have found in the Christopher Isherwood papers, really showing how David was celebrating the lives of Don and Chris, as well as celebrating their house and the life that they've created. on the picture is the picture. In the picture of David Hockney, his selfie, you can see that he has images taped to the painting in order to help and inspire and guide him as he's painting it. So outlined in red is actually the photograph that he had previously sent and previously took of Chris and Don, which is also the photograph that was used for the advertisements for this lecture. The Christopher Isherwood papers are a rich resource for diving into the history of Chris and Don, and especially their connection to this property and other artists' connections to this property. Next slide. For our final slide, you can see the final work of David Hockney, titled Christopher Isherwood and Don Bachardy, completed in 1968. And the full circle journey of how we got to this painting, which is only expressed through the documentation located in the Christopher Isherwood papers. And that concludes our presentation. I'll hand it back to Robert.
So we're happy to take questions from the participants.
So there's a couple of questions about the future fate of the property and the possibility of visits to the property and the circumstances in which the property might be visited in the future. That might be a question for Catherine as well as for Don and Tina. I don't know, but I think the audience will be interested in knowing what the longer term fate of the property might be.
Don is still living at the house, and so at the moment we can't really have anyone visit, but it may be that at some time in the future that will become possible.
Gorman Bentley is asking, where are the two HOCKNEY paintings today?
Christopher Isherwood and Don Bachardy is belongs to a woman who lives in London, and she has it in her apartment there. It's in private hands, and the studio and the big one. Well, that was fascinating, Alvin, what you did with that. And I loved seeing it broken up into parts. That's in Cologne, Germany, in a museum, and can be seen.
Thank you. So, Kate, I don't know whether you want to pick up some of the themes of the presentation, particularly.
Well, I was fascinated by so much of it, and the history of Santa Monica and a sort of time lapse thing was wonderful, because of course when Chris got there in 1939, it didn't look like it looks now. And I was thinking about his practice as a Hindu and his devotion to non-attachment and his determination not to have a grave, and reflecting on his childhood love of architecture. One of his favorite books as a kid was a book by Harrison Ainsworth called The Tower of London. And it's a book about the physical architecture of the Tower of London and how that architecture permits you to get into the history of people who were in the tower for one reason or another, the kings and queens of England, before their coronations, or in some cases, people imprisoned there before their executions. And he loved that book, and he had a really deep conviction that the physical place gives rise to the intellectual, emotional, spiritual activity. And so this physical house and the physical setting of Santa Monica, the recollection of that wonderful essay, California Story, that describes that, section of shore between Santa Monica and Venice, all those physical things were part of his creativity. They're all there, very vital in the novels, but to see the literal aspects presented and nailed down, and then we know the architecture from which the novels come. That's it's very exciting and wonderful to see.
Thank you. Carl Sylvester is asking whether Chris's typewriter is still in the house.
No, it must be at the Huntington.
Huntington. Oh, I see.
Oh, it's part of the Huntington collection. That's interesting. I didn't know that. Huh. My colleague Sandy Brooke is asking how any of you think the house, its setting, and especially the light, how important has all that been to Don's artistic practice?
What?
How has the light been important to your artistic practice?
Uh,
The lighting in the house?
Oh, the light in my studio is absolutely perfect for me. And putting the second floor on the original garage building has made it the ideal studio for me. And Chris and I realized how great the view was because we used to go up on the roof of the garage before the second floor was put onto it and sunbathe. And that's what decided us to put a second floor on, because the view of the canyon and the light was so wonderful. We wanted to bring it into my studio by putting another floor in the garage.
Thank you, Don. And is it still the case that you're painting in there every day now, or very regularly?
Yes, painting and still not every day lately, but certainly I haven't given up work, and I'm still working from scissors. So when I have sitting dates, I'm out in the studio working.
That's terrific. Thank you. This must be a question, I think, for Robert. So there's a question about the type of buildings that are eligible for consideration under the terms of the designation protocols. What happens if a person of historic or artistic or cultural significance lived in an apartment rather than a building?
I think a property associated with a person, whether they are renters or owners, would be equally significant. Again, they need to perform their important work at that property, but they need not be the owner. They need not have added on to the property. They simply need to have used it in a meaningful way. It needs to be really the most important property associated with them. And I noticed another question that's kind of related to that. And it's about whether a property is significant for somebody who's still living and working there. And I have to say that that is a challenge. And that's one reason why we have not yet, I would say, nominated the property to the National Register. The Maloof property that I shared as an example, Sam Maloof did his important work until just months before he passed away in 2009. And while we nominated the property initially in 2003, the keeper of the National Register essentially rejected it, sent it back to the state, and we updated it before it was listed in 2010. And that was really because Sam was still doing his important and productive work at the property. Right. So we're thrilled to have Don still actively working there. And that's not a criterion for consideration at the local level, this association with a living person.
Thank you.
I'd like to add on to that a little bit.
Please do, Nels. Yeah.
Since this is located in the city of Los Angeles, the Historic Preservation Ordinance for the city of Los Angeles includes the site, exterior, and interiors of properties that are designated. It runs with the property. However, cities like Santa Monica or West Hollywood, their preservation ordinance is a little bit different in that it really only covers the exterior of properties. So associations are significant because of the people that live there or the important events that might have happened there. So in the city of Los Angeles, when a property becomes designated for association, it really incorporates the whole property, including the whole building, the whole site, even if it is just associated with one person. However, in terms of review of projects at that property, the city will consider approval of projects that do not adversely affect the eligibility of the property, which would be the association. So for example, if a project was proposed in a property where one apartment was significant, it might be flagged as a historic property, but through the design review, the applicant would point out whether or not this project might affect the historic parts of the property, or those parts of the property that would contribute to the eligibility, which oftentimes are the exterior, sometimes are interiors. Or the designation could also just specify that the exterior is not significant and the interior is significant. For example, Robert, back me up here, there is a historic cultural monument for a office that has actually been deconstructed. And it's just the materials that were kind of adorning that office. So although the property is flagged in terms of the city as a historic cultural monument is at this property, it's actually not at that property, and it's in storage because the words of the historic cultural monument just designate the interiors of this office. Robert, what is the name of that one?
I'm not sure what you're referring to. It could be the Yasha Heifetz studio that was relocated.
No, I think it was the. I'll look it up. I'll have to send it out. But I think it's just an example.
I wanted to say something else about the light and the view from Don's studio. Tina will know this well. If you sit for a portrait for Don, he faces towards the canyon wall and the sitter faces out over that view, and you may sit there for no less than 45 minutes. And if you're really stoical and Don is really concentrating and on it, you could sit there for 3 hours.
Right.
And you will be looking out at the ocean and all of that scene that was so fascinatingly shown in the photographs down the ages. And I know that scene just about by heart, I think. And I think there must be hundreds of people who do, because so many have sat for Don in that studio for hours looking out
there are
over that view.
Clearly several people in the audience for whom that's true as well. A couple of the comments here suggest that. Would you like to say a little bit more about the timing of the application for the designation, Catherine? The foundation suggested this in 2018. So what prompted that particular application at that particular point in time?
Oh, I think it's been dear to all of our hearts for a long time. And certainly for Don, I mean, who moved into the house in 1959 and painted out, to start with, he painted out the gaudy colors that every single room in the house had been, painted by the previous owners. He stripped and waxed all the floors, and over the years, redesigning and redecorating. As an artist, he's been so engaged with the house, and it's a monument to day-to-day life. It's the private activity of two very busy people with their work and also a lot of friends and entertaining. Anyone who ever has the privilege of going into the house, whenever I meet them, they're always struck by some quality. It's not just the art, it's not just this, it's not just, there's a light flooding in, a gem-like something, a numinous quality. Right. And you want to hold on to it if you ever have the chance to experience it. And so I think all of us who are involved with the foundation have long wanted somehow to capture that, and hopefully to share it more widely. But certainly through a presentation like this, I mean, virtually you can share quite a lot. Sure. Don, I don't know if you want to say something about what it means to you to have the designation for the house and have some recognition of all that it's meant to live there with Chris.
To me, it's a huge satisfaction. And I take pride in the designation because I love this house. I've been in it now more than 60 years, and so much has happened here, and it's all associated in my head with Chris, and really the happiest years of my life. And I really do feel my studio is the perfect studio for me. Once that second floor was put on, and the light is so wonderful, I enjoy it still every day. And working upstairs with my sitter is still really my greatest pleasure as an artist.
Wow, that's terrific. There are so many memories in the Q&A here, Don, from people who visited the house or who sat for you. We will make sure we send these comments to you after the program is over, because I'm sure you would be delighted to read them. This is perhaps a personal question. I don't know whether you want to answer this, but I'm being asked to ask you whether we will ever get your memoirs.
Living with a writer taught me one very important truth, that living with a writer doesn't make writing contagious. It taught me quite rightly to stay in my studio, all of my artistic work out there, because Chris was the epitome of a writer's life, and he told me so much about it, and it cured me forever of thinking I'll write a little memoir or a little remembrance here and there. I did keep a journal for many years, but who knows how much longer that's going to survive. And I have given it up now completely, and just stick to my artwork.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering whether any of the other panelists would like to make a final comment before we close. Before you do so, I'd just like to thank you for a rigorous, wide-ranging and really fascinating presentation about the history of Santa Monica more generally, but also especially about the house and Chris and Don's life within it.
Steve, I'd like to point out that Don is actually coming to us live from the residence.
Sure.
I don't know if everyone has noticed, but he's actually sitting in the place that we were all just talking about for almost 2 hours.
Absolutely.
So I think that everyone can notice the point of view. There's the front door in the background. He's sitting at the table. I know that probably Don and Tina are facing towards the reflective mirror wall on the other side.
The mirror wall is on our right. The canyon view is right outside the windows. Yeah.
Fantastic.
I don't know if you can.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And also just a quick. Jay Bacon wrote a note. He asked if the historic culture monument I was referencing is the Lautner's Goldstein office, and that is it. It's the Lautner Design Goldstein office was designated. It was just the interiors, and it was salvaged and actually reconstructed at LACMA. But that was it.
Thank you, Robert. Alvin.
And if I could, this is Robert. I think that Don just described it remarkably. It's a place that references the associations with the people that are so important, and it has a sense of their being there, of their belonging, of what it was like to be there for 60 years. It shows all the accretions over time, and it's just a wonderful, remarkable setting to be in. And I look forward to the day when others can be welcome to experience it.
Terrific. Catherine, do you have any final comments?
No, because this has been wonderful, fascinating. I guess I would like to add one more thing. It is a great interest to me that the very last book Christopher Isherwood worked on was a book called California, in which he planned to use each of the places he lived in California as a setting to describe his experiences there. And so really the last book he worked on was about the house, and he didn't finish it because he died too soon, but I think that's a really interesting footnote to what's been discussed today.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you for sharing your expertise, your enthusiasm, and your passion for this project that's come across very, very strongly. It's been wonderful, Don, to have you with us, and we look forward to future programming in the series. I'd just like to thank our audience for staying with us throughout the afternoon and for asking so many interesting questions. I wish you all well. Be safe.
I'm so pleased to have seen all of this happening. It's been a delightful experience for me. And it's been way too long since I've seen Kate, and I want to tell Kate how wonderful she looks. I've never seen her hair so long and lighter than I've ever seen it. It makes me want to do a sitting with her right away. Another one, yeah.
That's the
How do you feel about doing that virtually, Don? Exactly. We might have to do it over Zoom.
Exactly. Exactly. Let's do it in person, right? As soon as possible. Thank you, everybody. Good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you for now.